Good day to you listeners, I hope this episode finds you well. This will be the first in our series of history episodes, and in the first 2 episodes I want to focus on 4 particular champions. I haven't thought of a fancy name for them yet, I hope I will have done by the time this episode goes up. The sort of 4 pillars of early pugilism. And they were not champions who ran consecutively, but rather individuals throughout a lengthy period of time who had a great impact on either the rules or the perception of professional fighting. We're going to be touching on a lot of ideas today that I thought I'd highlight some of them up front just so we can have a think about. The first one is the difference between the military martial arts and competitive martial arts. This is something you'll see in ancient China with Kung Fu as much as you will in Japan with Jiu-Jitsu and even England with good old-fashioned pugilism. Martial arts as a method, both armed and unarmed, typically find popularity through the training of armies. The very first sources we have on Chinese martial arts are basically military manuals, with brief sections on both armed and unarmed techniques. And then I want you to think about the difference between what a soldier would need to learn to fight for, and what a professional fighter would need to learn, because they are obviously very different. I mean, there have been a great many soldiers who have, or ex-soldiers, former soldiers, who have excelled in professional martial arts, professional sport, combat sports, but clearly the two are very different. And we're talking about today an earlier time where the populace doesn't seem to know that. And that'll be quite fun when we get to that later. A second theme I want to talk about today is sport versus spectacle. And this is a theme throughout combat sports journalism constantly. As a fight writer, you are acutely aware of the fact that people don't come for the green vegetables. They come for the pasta and the meat and the carbs and the protein. They don't want their nutrients. So you have to hide it in underneath them. And especially with things like Bellator nowadays, you have to ask, is it acceptable to use a freak show fight, even though it will have all kinds of negative impacts on public perception of your sport with the other sporting cultures, and will certainly lead to you being accused of being a sideshow rather than an actual sport. But is it acceptable to do that in order to get the punters in and then show them the beauty of the art further along the card? Obviously, in today, it isn't working out so great for most promotions that try it. If you have Mirko Cro Cop fighting some nobody in the main or co-main event, people will tend to just tune in for that and not watch the prelims with all your talented fighters. But back in the day, when we were trying to get people to turn out to amphitheatres to watch a night of fights, or perhaps even a whole day of fights, was it acceptable to use something, well, we'll get to this later, but downright horrific to get the punters in just out of morbid curiosity? But let's start our story, and unlike most good English stories, it starts with coffee. Now, England is known as a tea-drinking nation because it is the finest beverage on earth, and we get through gallons of the stuff. But before tea was introduced to England, and tea was a new thing in England around the 1600s, I think it's about 1660, Samuel Pepys is reported to have tried tea. That's tea with T-E-E as opposed to T-E-A, a Chinese drink he refers to it as. Whereas coffee is supposed to have been available in London in the late 1500s. And most importantly, the first sort of records of tea going on sale to the public are in coffee houses. So where most think of England as a tea-drinking nation, and nowadays it pretty much is, and certainly through the 1800s and 1900s it was, fascination in England started with coffee. And coffee houses were big because before coffee houses began opening, the place to hang out was either in a private residence or in a bar, a pub. The problem with the alehouse, of course, is that it gets very rowdy and there's mixed company. If you want to get your leg over, the alehouse is the place to be, but one of the main appeals of coffee houses when they began opening up in London was that many of them prohibited the entrance of women. So if you didn't want to have a rowdy night out and you just wanted somewhere to work or think or meet other men and talk, the coffee house was the place to be. And one of the most famous coffee houses was Old Slaughter's Coffee House. That was built by a guy called Thomas Slaughter in 1692 on St Martin's Lane. St Martin's Lane was a pretty well-off area of London at the time. In fact, it was one of the first areas that was paved, and the coffee house itself was often referred to as the coffee house on the pavement. Now, Slaughter's is important because it was a place frequented by artists. Artists, poets, people in the creative fields. So you had guys like Alexander Pope and William Hogarth, who's going to be important to the story later. And they would meet there, practice their art there, and eventually offer lessons out of nearby buildings. Additionally, Old Slaughter's Coffee House was running distance from Leicester Square, which is where the real upper crust spent their days at leisure. And if you're an artist and you want a patron, then it's always good to be within shouting distance of the wealth. And patrons are very important to this story. I have, inadvertently, for my first Patreon episode, picked a time which really emphasises how important patronage was to the early days of fighting. So in 1725, there's an argument raging at this coffee house. Someone has mentioned a brawler from Venice. And the stories about this guy are wild. They say that his arms are unreasonably long, and he had a punch so powerful that he could break any man's jaw. And as these things did in those days, it escalated into an argument. And if you're familiar with any sporting history, you'll know that a lot of professional sports, in fact a great many feats in these days, were driven on by bets from people with too much money and too much time on their hands, or sports and rakes as they used to be known. But at any rate, someone says this Venetian gondolier would be no match for an English boxer. And the Earl of Bath, who happened to be there, either visiting or hung out there regularly, said, "I'll bring this gondolier over. But who should we have him fight?" And we don't know who said it. Could have been William Hogarth. But someone said, "Send for Figg." Now, James Figg was the consensus first champion of London. He was one of the very first fighting celebrities. And he came in and he said, "I won't fight the gondolier, but I'll find someone who can." So he listened to what they said about the gondolier and what people had heard about him. And in an early example of styles making fights, Figg said, "Okay, I know just the man." He heard about the gondolier's reach, he heard about his punch, and so what he did was he went and found his most hard-headed student, the one who could take the beatings worst, or best rather, and who could repeatedly close the distance, or as they called it in those days, closing, to throw, because throws were legal at this time. In fact, what's called purring, which is, well, we'd call it soccer kicks and stomps, but in those days that was absolutely legal, and Figg won or defended his title in one instance by throwing a man and dropping the knee on him, and the guy gave up. So Figg picked a guy called Bob Whittaker, and Bob Whittaker had a head like a concrete block and could just keep moving in, and he had a very good, they call it a cross buttock, which is basically a primitive form of osotogari, the large outside reap. It's where you step deep across your opponent's lead leg and you drive them over your lead leg. And if you can do it well and fast, you can throw them right on the back of their head if you're good at it. So the fight takes place, and according to the account of Captain Godfrey, who is who we get a lot of these old accounts from, because even the first really prolific fight writers, guys like Pierce Egan, this predates them by a century. So Egan and people like that are working from the account of Godfrey mainly. And Godfrey, who was a student of Figg, says that the amphitheatre, Figg's amphitheatre, was packed to the roof with the classiest patrons it had ever seen that night. And what happened was that the gondolier knocked Whittaker off the stage early. They fought on a stage made of wood with fencing around it, which was wooden fencing, obviously, which is why the amphitheatre itself was called Boarded House. But when Whittaker was knocked from the stage, he got back in, he kept closing the distance, he kept trying to throw the gondolier, and he eventually hit him in the stomach, which Godfrey, in an example of the kind of jingoism that drove sporting achievement in England at the time, says that it was one English peg in the stomach, quite a new thing to a foreigner. And this links back to the national pride and jingoism that is used to really sell fights today. I mean, if you look at Conor McGregor, terrific fighter, yes, but there are now people in Ireland who are truly emotionally invested in his career, but wouldn't care otherwise if he wasn't Irish. And that's the reason that this fight was so popular, because it was a big scary foreigner and a young English lad giving him what for. Now, Whittaker had stayed at Figg's house throughout his entire preparations to this, and this is something that you'll see even up to Geoffrey's training for Johnson. You know, the old champ being like, "Come and live with me, and I'll look after your training." So he was put through the work by Figg, kept in shape, prepared for the fight, probably took a few beatings, and to thank him, James Figg, who was, as you'll see throughout this episode, a terrific promoter, not just a fighter. He said, "Whittaker's not even my best student. I'll find one who can beat him." And he did, and Whittaker got beaten. And that was Whittaker's thanks for helping out James Figg and making him look good in front of the Earl of Bath. Now, when talking about James Figg's life, it's interesting to ask the question, how much was he a man on the spot? And how much of his success was just his excellence? The man on the spot is a common theme in history. It includes everyone from Cecil Rhodes to Cortez. It's just being the first man there, or coming along at the right time. Sometimes it involves bravery, being willing to travel across the sea to an unknown place. Sometimes it involves dumb luck. Sometimes it involves being the first person to say, can we dig that out of the ground in bigger quantities? But before Figg, there were fighters. We know this because Timothy Buck is often listed as Figg's teacher. Certainly Figg spent some time at Buck's academy, but Buck had nowhere near the popular acclaim and success that Figg did. Even in Godfrey's Useful Science of Self-Defense, Godfrey, who is up on all the names of the time, and a student of Figg, obviously, mentions Buck once, just to say that Timothy Buck was a most solid master. It was apparent in his performances, even when grown decrepit, and his old age could not hide his uncommon judgment. He was a pillar of the art, and all his followers who excelled built upon him. Which is high praise indeed, but then later Figg is referred to as the Atlas of the Sword, and a gladiating statue with exclamation points. So really not a lot revealed about Buck there, but interesting that he was an established figure long before the Figg craze and the love of pugilism took off. So Figg appears in the city around 1714. Those are the first records of him. He was born in Oxfordshire, and Figg's move to the city coincides with a massive growth in the population of London and the cities generally. This is because we're in the early stages of what's called the Agricultural Revolution, which is where increased understanding of farming and new practices in terms of crop rotation, and later towards the end of the Agricultural Revolution, new inventions such as the seed drill, allowed bigger yields for less workers on the farms. So that freed up a lot of country dwellers to move to the city and pursue jobs there. It was this growing working class in the cities which served as the fuel, along with actual fuel, fossil fuel, for the Industrial Revolution, which came along shortly after. Now, the working class has always been the driving force behind the development of sporting culture. It is the upper classes who bring the money, but it's the lower classes who tend to need sporting endeavour to take their mind off the job. You see this with guys like Richard K. Fox making one of the first sports pages in the US, and he made so much money through it that he actually funded sporting contests that he could cover in the next issue of the newspaper. But a growing number of people, boredom, need for entertainment, these all feed into the growth of a sport. Figg, being the best fighter at the time, or becoming the best fighter at the time, was in a spot which his predecessors had not been in, with so many people wanting to watch him, and also attracting the attention of the upper classes. The Earl of Peterborough became Figg's patron, gave him money to bet on fights, and this is what fight purses were for a very long time. Up until even in the days of Jack Johnson, what would happen was you'd place a side bet, and the winner would take the money. And the only way you could make reasonable amounts of money, especially because most of these guys were people like Martin the Bath Butcher, just labourers. So if you're betting your hard-earned wages on your fight, and then you destroy your hands, because this is bare knuckle, remember? You destroy your hands on someone else's skull, you are taking yourself out of work for however long afterwards, or at least slowing yourself down. And the only way you can get the kind of money to make a bet worth that sort of risk, because it is a risk. You know, these are the days when you could lose food off your family's table. Very few fighters nowadays are actually starving, but you know, back then, this could be the difference between your family eating or not. There was an interesting case a good time after this, but Waterman Lyons was a ferryman from the Thames who won the title of Champion of London, and then immediately quit fighting and went back to rowing people over the Thames because he couldn't find anyone to back him. Because wealthy interest in fighters comes and goes. You had to be very lucky to find a patron, as Figg did. So the Earl of Peterborough bets on Figg's fights. Figg keeps winning. The only man who ever beat him was Ned Sutton, and they fought 3 fights, and Figg finished that as the winner. And with the money that he was able to earn by staying in the Earl's good graces and winning the Earl a lot of money in bets with other nobles and gentry, Figg was able to open Boarded House, the amphitheatre, on Marylebone Fields. And this amphitheatre was almost like the Roman Colosseum at times. The advertising material put out by Figg was largely printed or produced by William Hogarth, the painter that we mentioned earlier. Hogarth put out Figg's business card, advertising him as a teacher of the quarterstaff and backsword. There's no mention of him being a boxer on it. And Hogarth apparently printed the advertisements for Figg's events. Another way in which Figg made a good sum of money without the need for a side bet and the backing of the Earl of Peterborough was at boxing booths. There's a Hogarth painting called Southwark Fair, which shows sort of London at revelry. Just a massive fair and lots of people having fun and overindulging in various things. And then down in the bottom right of the corner, there's Figg looking surly and on horseback for some reason. That's a lot like the carnival days of boxing and wrestling, where you take your booth from town to town and you'd handle a few locals who'd had a bit much to drink and were happy to pay to have a go at you. But Boarded House gave Figg a chance to be a promoter and to hold his own fights. And so what happened was most of the best fighters in London gathered at Figg's and trained with him and became regulars on his stage. 2 in particular that we're going to be talking about later are George Taylor and Jack Broughton. But while we think of Figg as the first boxing champion of England, he was in fact, less of a boxer than all the other things he was, really. He was a quarterstaff master, and he was excellent with the backsword. Even Godfrey, who idolises Figg in his writing, describes Figg's boxing as not the most technical. He's a bit of a brute. Throws and kicking people while they're down seems to be the order of the day for Figg. But the strange thing about any sort of armed duel or contest is that it's up to the fighters to decide how serious it gets. In Germany and Europe, there was a trend for a while called Schlager, which is fencing, and the idea was to try and draw blood on your opponent's face. And that seems to be what a lot of these early bouts were. The backsword in particular, there's an account of one of Figg's peers slashing the calf muscle of his opponent and it just falling to the floor, and then later getting affected and the guy dying. But on all the advertising for this stuff, you'll see the weapons masters being described as giving demonstrations of excellent timing and control, or timing and measure is the other phrase they like a lot. In the last bout with Sutton drew first blood, and then Figg decided to stave in his knee with a cudgel. So it's a bit of an escalation between drawing some blood on someone's arm or face and then staving in their knee. But it was a weird culture, and as Godfrey said in his account of training with Figg, he went there because Figg didn't spare the rod. He'd smash your fingers up in sparring. But what Figg was able to do with Boarded House, firstly by having people like Jack Broughton and George Taylor there and showing off their skills regularly, but secondly by appealing to the lowest common denominator, to the filth, basically. The advertising material for Figg's events at Boarded House make a very big deal of there's always some kind of mutilation of an animal going on, whether it's strapping explosives to a dog or a bear, or taping a mule's mouth shut and allowing dogs to rip it to pieces. It's very gladiatorial, ancient Rome sort of stuff. There were people there, especially the richer classes were there to revel in the technical ability and the manly art, but you can get the poor people out their shops and into your amphitheatre by having some animal cruelty. I mean, even in Shakespeare's day, they had bear baiting, and bear baiting continued until quite late in London. But this wasn't a universal thing. Not everyone wants to see bears baited and dogs tearing things to pieces. There were letters of complaint sent and people trying to act against Figg. And the criticism of Figg and his amphitheatre wasn't forward-thinking people who believed in animal rights and things like that. It was mainly people, housewives and the like, who didn't like their men spending the day not in their shop or at their work, and instead watching fights. Famous poem, Bram Stone's Man of Taste, there's a line that says, "In Figg the prize fighter by day delight, and sup with Collie Cibber every night." And it makes you wonder, who is going to fights in the daytime? Obviously, the Man of Taste is supposed to be a wealthy person, but equally, and this is the same thing you'll find with theatre in even the Elizabethan days. There was a lot of criticism of theatre because it was dragging men out of their workplaces and costing their families money. So lots of these angry housewives petitioned for a halt to the activities of people like Figg. One of the best ones I've seen was a one in a newspaper imploring the head of the guard to take a match with Figg and show him what for with the quarterstaff. And this is what we were talking about at the beginnings, a soldier and a fighter. The guardmaster might be very good at his job, but his job isn't dueling full time, whereas Figg's was. As far as we can tell, that match never came about. But I suspect that the head of the guard would have lost some face there. But Figg wasn't just about the freak shows. He was, in many ways, he was very progressive because he was one of the first to promote a female fighter, as far as we can tell. Get onto that in a second. But the famous Elizabeth Wilkinson Stokes, or Elizabeth Wilkinson, an occasional appearance at Boarded House. The championess of Europe, she called herself. Some of the challenges that she put out in the newspapers and on this advertising material were absolutely amazing. I, Elizabeth Welks of Clerkenwell, having had some words with Hannah Highfield and requiring satisfaction, do invite her to meet me on the stage and box me for 3 guineas, each woman holding half a crown in each hand, and the first woman that drops her money will lose the battle. That's pretty badass. It's also a really interesting rule. You carry the purse and then whoever drops it first loses. Stokes is a fascinating character, or Wilkinson. She does actually change her name at one point, and there's a couple of theories as to why. Her husband, she married a promoter later on, and they actually had their own amphitheatre, the Stokes Amphitheatre. One academic actually argued that Elizabeth Wilkinson was more beloved by the populace than James Figg at the time, and tried to show that there were more references to Elizabeth Wilkinson Stokes than James Figg in the 17 and 1800s, and that afterwards the patriarchy, I suppose, changed it around so that Figg was the father of modern boxing. It's an interesting thought. Stokes is a fascinating character, and her snippets and challenges from newspapers are hilarious. If you want to read more about that, I would highly recommend the book She's a Knockout by L.A. Jennings, which covers her life as well as I think anyone's covered it. But Figg made the most of her at the amphitheatre. One more interesting appearance from Figg in sort of the 1700s equivalent of Ronda Rousey going off to shoot films or something like that is Figg's appearance in William Hogarth's A Rake's Progress. This is a sequence of 6 paintings which follow a young lad called Tom, who inherits his father's fortune, spends it away on enjoying himself too much, and then ends up in debtor's prison, and then finally in Bedlam, the famous Bethlehem hospital, mental hospital, which is still there. You can go and see that today, which is a strange decision, because you'd think that they'd just tear it down brick by brick and replace it with something else, with all the negative history and associations that it has. But in the second panel of this painting, Figg can be seen swarming around Tom with his fencing teacher and harpsichord teacher and a couple of others, and Figg is the quarterstaff master, and he's giving a disparaging look to the harpsichord teacher and the fencing teacher, apparently because those are French occupations, and the quarterstaff is very English. More of that jingoism that we love. So James Figg kicked the bucket in 1734. The interesting thing about his successors, George Taylor took over Boarded House, and a young man named Jack Broughton was offered his own amphitheatre with the backing of another earl, and those two had a sort of war of words in the press and eventually fought, and Broughton got the better of him. But the interesting thing is that both of those men made their fame as boxers rather than as duelists with any kind of weapon. Just as Stokes was a boxer, Elizabeth Stokes, whereas Figg considered boxing just a part of the game. He was a guy who used the quarterstaff and backsword and cudgel. So even though Figg was supposedly the father of modern boxing, it doesn't seem like he wanted to be. It seems like the populace were craving for the boxing matches, and Figg saw them as part of the game. And I suppose that is because of the accessible nature of boxing. Anyone can, if you have an argument with someone, you can write a letter to them in the newspaper and have a boxing match about it. Whereas swinging around a backsword, if you're not trained and practiced with it, is quite dangerous. Certainly it's hard to imagine people like butchers and other labourers having the time to learn all these weapons, whereas a guy like Captain Godfrey could, because he was a military man. But boxing has that social openness to it. Anyone can take part. So Broughton becomes known as the champion of England. George Taylor was for a while, and he kept up a friendship with Hogarth. When Taylor died, William Hogarth did the prints for his gravestone, and they are of him firstly grappling with death in a cross-buttock throw, and secondly of him standing over death, having conquered death. But that's a weird thing to have on your gravestone, because you're looking at the evidence that clearly didn't happen. One of the interesting things about George Taylor is that he was something of an also-ran. Godfrey remarks on him briefly in A Treatise upon the Useful Science of Defence. Godfrey even admits that George Taylor, known by the name of George the Barber, sprang up surprisingly. He says that he beat everyone but Broughton, and Godfrey felt that he did himself an injustice by fighting Broughton at the zenith of his age and art, while George Taylor was only 20 years old at the time. And that was the one that really decided Jack Broughton as the champion of England. Broughton came in and out of activity. In 1741, he apparently retired, and Taylor just went back to being the champion of England. Taylor eventually went and worked for Broughton at his amphitheatre. And according to some sources, Taylor was even called the champion of England when Slack later refused to fight him, because Slack was just a shady individual altogether. But Taylor takes up an interesting place in history, and had he beaten Broughton when he was at the height of his powers, perhaps the very rules of the game would be different. The one other thing that Godfrey says about Taylor is that he makes it clear that technically there were very few who matched Taylor, even Broughton, but that Taylor wasn't in possession of what they always refer to in these old texts as limitless bottom. Bottom being durability. Nowadays we talk about a guy's chin, but back in the day it was just an accepted thing that you took punishment, and your ability to take that over a good period of time was what decided whether or not you you had bottom. And Godfrey says that if Taylor's bottom matched the rest of his abilities, he'd have been peerless. But Broughton had tremendous success with his academy in Tottenham Court Road, rather. And Broughton's amphitheatre is important because it was the birthplace of the rules of boxing. As we already mentioned, purring, kicking guys while they were down, was totally legal in Figg's day. When Broughton had a match with a coachman named George Stevenson in 1741, Broughton was apparently ill and suffered a speed disadvantage for the entire fight, but grabbed a hold of Stevenson and pinned him against the corner of the stage on which they were fighting. And he held him there for several minutes, apparently, and exhausted him, and then released him and sent him to the ground. And Broughton's forte was both the cross-buttock throw and hitting what they used to call the mark, and even Broughton's mark, which is the solar plexus. Because if you are fighting bare knuckle, it benefits you to aim for the body, as opposed to smashing your hands on the opponent's head. So Broughton was masterful at putting guys down with body shots. And he floored Stevenson, and Stevenson later died from the result of that fight. And that inspired Broughton to put together some rules. And when he opened his amphitheatre, it was a case of my house, my rules. And you'll see this as a force for change in boxing throughout its history. It's when the guy gets the title and decides to start making changes that everyone else has to sit up and pay attention, because you want that title, you have to go after it. One of the most notable ones is John L. Sullivan. He won the heavyweight championship of the world, both bare knuckle and gloved, and then he decided that he would only be fighting gloved from then on. So that effectively killed bare knuckle boxing, as a major pursuit at any rate. The significant parts of Broughton's rules, which were fairly slim on content, were that if a fighter has fallen, he has 30 seconds to come up to the mark, to the line, which was in the middle of the ring or platform or wherever you were fighting. Had 30 seconds to come up to the line, and if he didn't make that, he was declared beaten. But you could go down as many times as you wanted. So you see in the days of Mendoza, guys happily taking a knee just to avoid or just to take a break for 29 seconds. The other important rule that he instituted was that kicking guys while they were down was now illegal, and picking guys up from below the waist. So while Broughton loved his cross buttock, he didn't like guys grabbing a hold and tackling him. But Broughton is responsible for giving us boxing as it is now, effectively. And he also introduced the mufflers, the gloves. While they weren't adopted in fighting until a century and a bit later, they did allow him to train without opening up cuts and things like that. And it allowed him to put out advertising material saying that he taught boxing with the greatest gentleness and things like that. Broughton's fall came in 1750 when he accepted a match with the Norfolk butcher, Jack Slack, and took a beating and lost his backer, the Duke of Cumberland, who'd paid for him to have this amphitheatre, lost him a tremendous amount of money at 10-1 odds. So that's when, to be honest, public opinion turned on boxing quite a bit. And it didn't help that Slack was a shady character who competed in fixed fights, and then his students would win the title and then drop the title to his other students and things like that. So what you got there was boxing rising at an incredible rate in public esteem and interest from Figg to Broughton, and then suddenly falling off a cliff. And you got guys like George Meggs and Bill Stevens who didn't inspire half the confidence that Figg and Broughton had as champions. Now, the interesting thing in history generally is to consider what might have happened if that man hadn't been there. Because history is sometimes treated as a business of names and dates, or great men, that's what they call it, history of great men. But often, great men are just riding on a wave of enthusiasm for a certain idea, or against a certain idea. The obvious ones are things like Adolf Hitler. He was democratically elected, so it makes you wonder if someone else had been there spouting the vitriol that people wanted to hear at the time, would they have got the gig as Führer instead of Hitler? Or was it that Hitler was a force of personality, and anyone else being in that place and time instead of him would have struggled to do the same thing. What is that, Godfrey's Law, where you go to the most extreme example and it's always Hitler? But I mean, you can do it with almost anyone. Cecil Rhodes was the example I gave earlier, if someone else had been there first. Columbus is a good one. Cortez, it's basically how much are we a product of our times and our circumstances, and how much of our own future do we make, to get philosophical with it. But clearly there were weapons masters before James Figg, and had he not been there, we could say Ned Sutton would be the man, but what's to say that the Earl of Peterborough likes Ned Sutton? He might not like his attitude, he might not like the cut of his jib, he might not like the look of him. It might have just been something particular about James Figg that the Earl of Peterborough liked. Famously, Charles Darwin ended up on the Beagle voyage because the captain was looking for a gentleman who he could consort with while at sea, and he picked Darwin because of the shape of his nose. There's nothing to say that the Earl of Peterborough didn't have some strange reason for liking James Figg like that. And to take that further on, what if George Taylor had bested Jack Broughton in their first go-around? Would Broughton have found the patronage and opened his own amphitheatre? Would George Taylor's amphitheatre have been more successful? And would his rules, therefore, have been the ones that were carried forward? What if, instead of Broughton and Taylor, some old-school arms master in the mould of Figg or Buck, but what if he had bested them and insisted that they also do the rounds of backsword and quarterstaff? And equally, was there any demand for that? Because James Figg could have been carrying forward a sport that the public didn't really care about, and they just wanted to see the fistfights. Certainly the fistfights are what resonated with the public most, because they are what we still have today. I mean, fencing is still popular, but it's nowhere near as popular. And certainly it's not a professional sport like fighting is. I mean, there's further interesting questions right on the end of our story today. What if Broughton hadn't taken offence to something that Slack had said about him and opted to fight him? Because this was getting towards the end of Broughton's athletic life, and Slack had already lost to Taylor, but by giving Slack a chance to fight him, Broughton got beaten up and cost his patron a lot of money. And Slack himself ended up hurting boxing more than anyone else up to that point ever could, through fixed fights or suspected fixed fights. But that is the nature of all of this stuff. It's important to remember that we are not dealing with exact records and the meticulous details that we keep about fighters nowadays. What we're dealing with is reputations, as with the Elizabeth Stokes and James Figg thing. Perhaps Elizabeth Stokes was twice the celebrity that James Figg was at the time. And perhaps during the 19th and 20th century, people felt uncomfortable with Stokes being so popular and wanted to aggrandise James Figg for all his masculine qualities. We don't really know. Certainly most interesting is to consider how much the game has changed based on those rules. Things are usually outlawed because they're, in any sport, because they're game-breakingly effective, too dangerous to the fighters, too dangerous to the participants if we're talking any sport, or occasionally they'll ban things that make the game exceptionally slow and boring. But clearly Broughton's rules, the coming up to the mark within 30 seconds, were an attempt to make the game safer, though 30 seconds is a long time, so any time a fighter was beaten, he was truly beaten. You'd have to be knocked out cold completely, or even guys who get knocked out cold wake up quicker than that, so you basically got to admit you're done. But the other rule that was quite important in Broughton's new rules was the no grabbing below the waist. Now, we know that they all loved throws, but as Nick Diaz would say, could they stop a double? Clearly that was enough of a problem that they had to do something about it. But equally, it makes you wonder how useful that would have been had they banned the purring, the attacking on the floor, and continued to allow the takedowns below the waist. Because it stays very rough and ready. But in the next episode, when we talk about Mendoza, he won a fight where his opponent was dropping to his knees and using the time to recuperate and avoid punishment, but stay in there long enough. Mendoza won the fight by holding him up and telling him to submit. So it stays very wild and not at all like the boxing game that we know for a long time yet. But the themes from this episode carry through not only to the next episode, but to today. Patronage is very important in the fight game, or rather, finding someone with money is important with the fight game, or them finding you. Because like it or not, if no one's backing you and you've got no money, you can't do this. And sometimes that's a promoter finding some young slugger and saying, this guy's exciting, I'm going to put him in some pro fights and promote him myself. Sometimes that's a guy going through the Olympic system in boxing or something like that. But it's a case of getting found and supported. The my house, my rules thing is still a constant. The guy who believes he has more negotiating power will still attempt to get one up in the negotiations, not just in money, but also in rematch clauses and things like that. Great example of messing around with the rules is Tyrone Spong when he fought Nate Corbett the first time. Corbett, very famous for his elbows. They were fighting in the Muay Thai World Championship match, and somehow Tyrone Spong got it set up so that the elbows were banned. But the my house, my rules, or rather the taking my ball and going home thing of once you've got the title dictating the terms is incredibly important to one of boxing's biggest stories, which was Jack Johnson. And in fact, anyone who was in the running to become the first black heavyweight champion, because there were Jack Johnson, Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, and a couple of others who just fought each other in circles dozens and dozens of times because there was none of them were getting anywhere near the title shot. Johnson eventually did, and when he got there, he said, "I'm sorry, I can't fight any black guys. No one will pay for that." And a final sort of theme from today is that the public will always like what it likes. You can't control what people want to see. And that's been quite hard for MMA because the ground game is quite alienating. But even the majority of people who follow MMA would rather see a good knockout than a submission or a long grappling contest. And I can't help but wonder if James Figg felt the way about people not appreciating the weapon arts, as many of the sort of hardcore MMA fans feel about fans who don't appreciate Damian Maia or Shinya Aoki or Ben Askren or people like that, where you're banging your head against the wall trying to get people to appreciate this. The other two champions that I wanted to discuss in this first couple of episodes about four great champions come a good while after Broughton, but then are consecutive. And one had a tremendous impact on boxing as an art, perhaps more than any other fighter ever, and the other had an impact on its social standing. We'll discuss those guys next time, but I would love any feedback that you guys would like to give me on the format of this show. I went back and forth for a long time about how I was going to do it, formally, informally, and so on, before I decided on just rapping into the mic. But yeah, any feedback you would like to give me is much appreciated. You're all my patrons, and I thank you so much for supporting me in the podcast. And any requests you would like to make for future episodes, history-wise, I would love to hear. We might also splice these up with some private conceptual episodes or something like that. It depends what you guys want to hear. I mean, I tried not to be too dry today. If it came across too dry, give me let me know, and I'll try and dampen it up next time. But once again, thank you so much for listening and for giving me a platform. And I'll catch you next time. Cheers.